Since essentially the crowd outside is in the hall, it saves me repeating the first part. So let's just say all protocols observed. And welcome to the launch of this book, Fees Must Fall, and its aftermath, Violence, Wellbeing, and the South African Students' Movement, published by the Human Sciences Research Council. Permit me to make a few observations and comments on the book. In 2015, I observed the fallist movements and student protests from New York, where I headed the Andrew Mellon Foundation's International Higher Education Program. In that capacity, I made a grant to the HSRC for research and writing on the protests. My first book was on black student university politics, from Sasso to Sansko, 1968 to 1994. And my interest sitting in New York was in research that deciphered the meanings and explained the student protests of 2015, 2016, including the continuities and the discontinuities with past protests, and especially what was distinctive about the fallist protests. I noted then in 2015, 2016 that there was a re-entry in very visible ways of the South African university students onto the higher education terrain. This was not to say that students were not part of steering and shaping higher education through institutional governance structures, including at UKZN, or that there were no student protests between 1994 and 2015. There were many protests, especially at the historically black universities and at those institutions that were merged as part of the restructuring of the higher education landscape after 2000. However, as you read what was happening in 2015, 2016, it was being suggested that there was something especially dramatic and distinctive about the 2015, 2016 protests. And I, for one, was very curious to learn where in lay this drama and what was distinctive about these protests. Okay. I mean, some people joked, it's because it's happening at UCT and WITS that it's dramatic. When it happens at Forte and Venda, it's not dramatic. The newspapers ignore it, actually, right? But it happens regularly. So I asked myself questions like, did they have to do the breadth and depth of mobilization, the targets of opposition, and the nature of the demands? Which were very different, of course, from protests before 1994. Or was it possibly that they served as a salutary reminder of the tardy pace and limited degree of transformation at universities and in higher education? And given the connections between higher education and society, did they also signal an impatience with change and the limits of change in the wider economic, political, and social dilemmas? I mean, who can forget that particular photo with that woman standing with great dignity? You promised us dreams. I'm here for the refund. Absolutely said everything. You promised us dreams in 1994. Now in 2015, I'm here for the refund. So how should the 2015-16 protests be theorized, as we are scholars and we are universities? And what is their character and significance for universities, higher education, and the wider polity and society? Were the 2015-2016 protests, I wondered and wrote about this, one manifestation of the organic crisis of South African higher education, a crisis that necessitated urgent and major formative action, as all organic crises do, on the part of the state and key actors? And we could ask questions about that too, whether there has been significant interventions on the higher education terrain in the last 7 years. The reality, as we know, was that state funding was grossly inadequate to support universities to undertake their critical purposes. And we need to be reminded constantly about what these critical purposes are, because it seems to me that we're forgetting this. And these critical purposes are, as universities, is to produce knowledge. It is to cultivate high-quality graduates. and it is to engage meaningfully with diverse communities. Also inadequate was funding to ensure that learning and teaching, research and institutional culture were substantively transformed and helped to realize environmentally sustainable economic development in South Africa, equity and social justice, and the extension and deepening of democracy. All the things we have been promised by the Constitution of this country. So, writing and thinking about it at that time, I argued for imaginative theorization, extensive, rich description, and rigorous analysis of the 2015-2016 protests, and for fully documenting, to create a real repository on the trajectory, the dynamics, the character and significance of the student protest movement that emerged and that grew during the course of 2015 and 2016. And I also argued at that point that scholarship had to avoid both spectacular claims, there were too many of those spectacular claims, that this was about, that capitalism was about to fall, for example, because of the fallist movements, as well as fanciful predictions about the future trajectory and significance. It had to illuminate and convey understanding of the protests in all their richness and complexity. And the Cabral, the Amilcar Cabral dictum was very important here. Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. Because in these struggles and protests, there are too many lies sometimes too. It's very hard to mediate about what is truth and what is lies and so on. So this book that we launch here tonight is a collaborative endeavor between researchers at the HSRC and the University of Venda and former student activists and student leaders. It's a welcome contribution to efforts to document and understand the 2015-2016 student protests associated with Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, and outsourcing and other movements. The book contains over 100 photographs, captions and narratives that arise from action research conducted with student leaders and activists on 5 university campuses that were involved in the 2015 and 2016 protests. As we've been told, University of Western Cape, Free State, Venda, Fort Hare, and Durban University of Technology. Apart from Fort Hare, actually, the other interesting thing about all these universities is none of them have a critical institutional history. There's no history of those universities at all, as there is with Rhodes, UCT, WITS. Fort Hare has got more than one history, actually, and a new one is coming out by Loiso Otshela soon. And as they say, these universities were selected deliberately to highlight the experiences of students at universities that, unlike the University of Cape Town and Witwatersrand, were not in the public spotlight in 2015-2016, but whose experiences could be actually more representative of the sector as a whole. With respect to UCT and WITS, they're not highly representative of the university sector in South Africa for various reasons. Okay. So that said, I want to invite comment by the authors, Dr. Thierry Lucia and Dr. Kyomo Morewe, to start with. We'll then go on, and we have 2 discussants with us who I'll introduce afterwards, and then we will have time for questions, comments, and discussion. And I would like this to be a really critical but empathetic environment, empathetic in terms of what the authors have tried to do. It's not an easy thing to publish a book. Anyone who has published a book knows. But at the same time, we also have to be critical and interrogate the book and not be shy to make our own views known. And this is the start of a conversation. We're not going to end it here tonight. So with those words, let me invite one of the authors to start.
Thank you so much for these introductory words and also explaining a bit where the book actually comes from historically with the project. Maybe I must have my little coming out here. I've known Professor Salim Badat for 21 years. So I'm 32. For 21 years, and I have known of him even before that, precisely because I also studied the student politics as one of my research interests. And if I remember correctly, it was I published in the Mail and Guardian that Professor Badat actually called me up and said to me, I want to speak to you. Come and have lunch with me. I'm in Cape Town next week. And I ended up coming there and being extremely shy and very, very nervous, because I knew that he was a professor at UWC. He wrote this major work on black student politics under apartheid, and he was now the CEO of the Ministers' Advisory Body, the Council on Higher Education. At the end of this conversation, I had a job. I was a master's student, and I had just been asked to join the Council on Higher Education as a research officer. And it was the start of something amazing, actually, a journey that has led us to this point. And that's how it happens sometimes. And if I probably would have said, oh no, I am not going to have lunch with this strange person, who is this anyway, you know, we would probably not be here tonight. The book comes from a project, as Prof. Badat said, that started in 2016. In fact, it was at the end of 2015 when I got what was then Skype. That was that version of Zoom, for those who can still remember, a Skype call from New York to say, Thierry, that was literally the word, Thierry, are you having your finger on what's happening here in South Africa? And I was like, I think I know what you're talking about. And we got together, a group of researchers at the time, Leanne Naidu, who is now at the University of Cape Town, was at Witwatersrand, Jose Kessi, Omar Baja from South African History Online, Carl Collison, famous journalist and the person who actually curated the photo exhibition outside, and a couple of others, and decided that this is indeed the moment that needs to be critically documented, critically described, analyzed, and interpreted. Fees must fall, as it turned out eventually, was in 2015-16 the largest social movement South Africa in post-apartheid years has ever seen. And its reverberations, of course, we see across the world. We had Royale Must Fall at Harvard. We had Fees Must Fall in India in 2019. In Uganda, we had a Fees Must Fall protest in 2019 as well. We had in 2021 a recall of Fees Must Fall in Braamfontein, a very tragic moment where an uninvolved person was shot, so much so that